Hello, everyone. Good morning. First of all, I'll just say apologies if anything's a little bit slow. I run all this through Graham's computer. Graham's computer is in a super secret location today and may take on the guise of a potato. But I'm going to start off. First of all, I make comments about my hair. I've had my hair cut, so my hair should behave itself. There's no jumper this morning because, again, it's not very cold. I usually put the jumper on when I go to my studio, which is not here. But I'm going to start off with some good news because it's Happy Friday, everyone. And there has been some very good news because politics can get a little bit distressing. And I'm going to go over the misery of politics. I'm going to discuss how the reasons why the Daily Mail this morning on its front page has had to talk about what a woman is, because they can't really talk about any of Rishi Sunak's key priorities because they've all gone a bit wrong this week. But before we get on to that, some people may be aware that there was a bit of an incident somewhere. I don't actually know where it was, but there's a lady who turned her garden into an allotment to grow fruit and vegetables for people on benefits, pensioners in her area, people who were struggling with the cost of living. And some arseholes basically a few days ago decided to jump over at night and salt the whole area, completely destroying its capacity to grow anything. And she was very upset, of course. She did have a GoFundMe page already because she was doing this for the community, and it had a few £1,000s in it. And people were sharing this GoFundMe thing. In fact, Alex saying, didn't she get 170,000? That may have been yesterday. I'm on it right now. As of right now, it's on about £225,000. And this is the thing. You can sometimes look at this country and you look at our government, particularly from the outside, you would see, we must be a really nasty country, really unpleasant. Look at our government. How can we keep voting it in? And sometimes I think about it and I think, are we really that unpleasant? Or, because sometimes you look at polling and the sort of things people believe as well, and you think, But you look at something like this, there's 14,000 people donated to this. Some people would have donated to it beforehand, just in the local area. But since this happened, 14,000 people, and there's some big donations. There's like a £2,000 donation in there, £1,000, quite a lot of £500, £100. I put 100 in myself. But other people will have just been giving what they can. And, it's things like this that just remind you. And it's the same, when Nigel Farage had a pop at the RNLI for rescuing migrants in the sea, and they got record donations. And it's things like that that just remind you, we have a cruel government, we have a deeply unpleasant media, and the media does often warp people's views. But fundamentally, we're actually very nice. We just don't have a system that reflects our human nature, really. But anyway, that was the good news. Onto the bad. Well, bad news for Rishi Sunak. Actually, bad news for all of us, because ultimately these are things that are problems for the country as well. So I'm going to kick off with Rishi Sunak's 5 pledges. We're not nasty, we're just gullible politically, yes. So Rishi Sunak in the new year made 5 pledges. And these 5 pledges, he said, you judge me on these. Now, to be honest, voters can judge him on whatever they like. They can judge him on, the style of his glasses if they want. It's entirely up to people how they choose to use their vote in the ballot box. But he has suggested that they judge him on these 5 things. And it was halving inflation this year, growing the economy, falling national debt, waiting lists, reducing NHS waiting lists, and stopping the small boats, the channel crossings. So you look at today's news, the Daily Express is banging on about Prince Harry, of course, and the Daily Mail is saying, well done, Rishi Sunak knows what a woman is, unlike Keir Starmer. Is that the best they can do with? Why might that be? Well, first of all, let's go down the list, shall we? Halving inflation. First of all, we would expect inflation to come down anyway, really. But is it really First of all, inflation's rising at the moment. Technically, the last time we got a figure for inflation, it was increasing. Now, we would still expect it to decrease this year, but from people's point of view, do people care about inflation? Not really. What people care about is how much more can you afford than you could the previous year. So if inflation is 6%, but your income increases by 7%, inflation is not a problem. But if inflation goes up by 6%, but your income only goes up by 2%, that is still 4% lower. 4%, drop for you. So your inflation really is the inflation figure minus your income increase. And if the inflation is higher than people's income increase, they're not going to feel it. So he's not going to get any electoral benefit from claiming he's halved inflation. But the other problem is inflation's not falling as quickly as he would like. Well, at the moment it's rising. But even globally, I've seen American economists recently saying that in America, inflation's not falling as quickly as they expected. So there's a bit of an issue there, and that's going to have a knock-on effect on us. And remember, we are artificially increasing inflation. If you think about the largest contributor to inflation at the moment, it's energy prices, because thanks to Rishi Sunak, our energy prices literally doubled in the space of a year. Didn't in France, they went up by a few percent. In this country, they doubled. In other European countries, they went up by more than France, but nowhere near double. And you ask, why was this? Well, it's because the high gas prices. Well, the wholesale price of gas is now much lower, but our energy prices are still high. So because Rishi Sunak refuses to apply windfall taxes to oil and gas companies, he's applying them to renewable energy providers, but not oil and gas companies. Because of that, he could use that to then subsidize the energy bills, but he's not doing. So he's keeping inflation artificially high. Second one, economy growing. Well, the latest news is it was flatlined. In fact, let me just show you. Can I find it? There we go. This is my head's in the way. This is our economy. That's how it looks. At the moment, it's flat, but even when it's not, like when they're talking about growth, it's like 0.1, 0.2% growth, and then it goes to minus 0.1, 0.2%. That's not growth, that's flat. And it's been flat for a long time. That big spike you can see there in 2021 was because of the big drop. If you see the big drop at the start of 2021, that was because that was COVID, and we suffered more than any other advanced nation. So we got then this big boost as we recovered. Because remember, a percentage growth is only comparing it to your own economy. But since then, it's gone flat again. And it was flat before then. It's been flat for years. We have this term creeping in called stagflation, which means a stagnant economy, because 0.1% growth is technically growth, but it's worthless. It should be 1, 2, 3%. And of course, high inflation. But so that's not going to help him either at the moment. If I go back, what's his next pledge? His next pledge was reducing national debt, but his budget means lots of borrowing for the next 2 years. The budget technically means that the borrowing will reduce after the next election, but he's not going to be around after the next election if he doesn't win it. So that's worthless. And at the moment, there's, again, reading the financial news, there's now large numbers of defaults reported from banks. So people defaulting on their mortgages, people defaulting on other loans, businesses defaulting. So banks are now, and according to the Financial Times, the level of defaults, the last 2 times we've seen this level. So first of all, in the first quarter of 2020, well, we shut down the economy. Lots of businesses, and it's all right to, furlough helped some people, but remember, there was 3 million self-employed people who got no help at all from the government. So of course there were lots of defaults then, people who couldn't repay loan payments. But the previous time it happened was after the banking crisis. So basically what we've got now is banking crisis levels of defaults being reported by banks without the banking crisis. So why is that? So that is not conducive to debt falling, because that suggests people cannot afford the cost of living, so they're having to default. That suggests that there's going to have to be more benefits payments. So the government expenditure is going to increase, which means borrowing will increase. Let's catch up with a few comments before I go for the next two, because the next two are beauties. You saw a couple of the papers also claiming Labour had blown its lead. Oh, well, do you know what? It's like I'm psychic. Should we have a little look at this? So, my head's in the way again. We need to get better at this. The gap has narrowed. The gap has, I'm going to keep my head there for a bit. The gap has, no, it's in the wrong place. I need to get better at this. The gap has narrowed, but you can still see it's higher than it was when Boris Johnson was in charge. And remember, the reason they got Boris Johnson, yes, they said, oh, it's the Chris Pincher thing, last straw and all that. Ultimately, the reason they got rid of Boris Johnson is because he was going to lose them the next election. So the gap between Labour and the Conservatives at the moment is still greater than when Tory MPs panicked and jettisoned Boris Johnson through the airlock. Basically, what Sunak has done is close the gap that Liz Truss created. So it's still, and you could look at it as closing, and maybe it'll close further. Maybe it will. It'll be interesting to see the next round, though, because all the polls we're getting at the moment, the field work, and even this one, this is YouGov's from yesterday, the field work was all carried out before the Labour attack ads. So we're still to determine whether they've had any impact or not. Let me just put this back. Let's see any other comments. As a renewable shareholder, I'd vote against the Conservatives out of spite, if nothing else. This is the worst government in my lifetime. It's the worst in my lifetime. I mean, I grew up in the Thatcher days, but at least she had some political ideas. My biggest beef with Thatcher, and this is someone growing up in a mining village, was less about the industrial changes. It was more that communities were abandoned. If you say to a load of miners, look, your industry is coming to an end, we need to find new jobs for you. And that's what the government sorts out. It encourages investment. So those people ultimately wanted to put in an honest day's work for an honest day's pay. That's what they wanted, to be able to provide for their families. And they didn't. It was like, this industry needs to end for whatever reason. Obviously, now it would have done anyway. Sort yourselves out, find your own jobs. So she just lay waste to the north of England because she was removing the major employer from entire communities without replacing it. Whereas what's going on now is not thoughtless or heartless. It's just greed. It's greed everywhere. They're not helping anyone. It's not even like they're only interested in certain groups or there's no political ideology behind the Tories anymore. It's just naked greed. And for the very small number of people. Has any Tory MP explained why there's always money for MPs to get a pay rise, but never for the public service? I would say more than that. How come they can afford staggering levels of waste, of money being spent on nothing? I mean, recently I did a video where I went through Rishi Sunak in 1 year as Chancellor. The National Audit Office has reckoned that in that year 2020 to 2021, that the amount of public money just wasted on fraud was up to £58 billion. Now, it was an average, because there's a bit of a range. So there's oh, hi, Max. Hello. There was an average of £46 billion. So we'll say £46 billion because there was a range. That's money just wasted on fraud that he won't chase up. Then there's £37 billion on test and trace, or track and trace it was called, which they called NHS track and trace, but was nothing to do with the NHS. What did I say now? So now you're up to £83 billion, aren't you? because all of that was wasted by it. You might think to yourself, well, a track and trace system, even if it wasn't ideal, is still useful. Yes, it would have been, but Parliament concluded that our track and trace system did nothing. It was worthless. There were countries that were spending a few tens of millions on it, and it worked. Ours had a budget of 37 billion and didn't work, didn't do anything. It's like if we'd not done it at all, it would have made no difference. It was that useless, sorry. So that's 83 billion pounds. So that's already more than Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng cost us with their kamikaze budget. And then in the same year, he also failed to ensure his bond buying scheme, which cost us 11 billion pounds again. That's just 11 billion pounds that was just wiped off the budget. So that's 94 billion pounds in one tax year that was just wasted. It's not that we didn't get value for money from it. We didn't get anything from it. Nothing. 94 billion pounds. Rishi Sunak was the Chancellor. And that's not including the money that Boris Johnson ordered him to waste. Like, you know, when Boris Johnson was coming up with feasibility plans for his first of all, bridge and then tunnel between Scotland and Ireland. I'm not counting that because that was Boris Johnson. Rishi Sunak will have been ordered to spend that money. So I'm not counting any of that. I'm just counting money that would have been Rishi Sunak's responsibility. And yet, Rishi Sunak is considered the safe pair of hands. It's ridiculous. It's absolutely ridiculous. But anyway, shall we carry on? So you can see how the Daily Mail couldn't really talk about inflation falling because it's growing. They couldn't talk about the economy growing because it's not. They can't talk about debt falling because that's not. So then waiting lists. So waiting lists on the latest figures have come out this week and they're going up. So NHS waiting lists are going up. So they can't talk about that. So then there's the small boats. Well, Rishi Sunak just did an interview yesterday with Conservative Home, which is the Conservative equivalent of what we're hoping this will become. And he said he doesn't think he'll be able to stop the small boats after all. So this promise that he made in January, and voters should judge him on it, it's only April, and he's already said, no, it's not happening, mate. And I'll tell you something else as well. As soon as he made that announcement yesterday, I don't know whether anyone saw on Twitter, Andrea Leadsom wrote a letter to Rishi Sunak urging him to leave the European Court of Human Rights. Now, there is no leaving the European Court of Human Rights. Of course, what you're talking about is leaving the Council of Europe as well as the United Nations. Because even if we did leave the Council of Europe, basically the things they're moaning about, the international laws, we're still bound by them because of our membership of the United Nations. So basically, what some of these Tories are calling for when they say leave the European Court of Human Rights, what they really mean, Andrew Jenkin, indeed, yes, what they really mean is leave the United Nations. But they can't say that because that's insane even to their supporters. But you think as soon as Rishi Sunak said that, they were coming out like this again. And you think to yourself, why is this? The Express were reporting a little while ago, there's quite a few Tory MPs who think that Rishi Sunak, in order for them to win their seats, he has to deal with the small boat problem. In fact, they were saying he can't even wait till next year. He needs to sort it this year, this autumn. Even if the election's next year, it needs to be sorted in this year because they're worried about losing too much support to Reform UK. And the problem is when you lose support, it's very difficult to get it back. You know, if you consider, for example, if I go back to these polls, which my head's going to be in the way of again, if you consider the fact that the polls have narrowed, that is not because people who were previously saying they would vote Labour have decided to vote Conservative. That's not the case. What's happened here is there were a load of people who, when Liz Truss was Prime Minister, were don't knows. They were really Conservative voters who were saying don't know because they knew they couldn't vote for a Liz Truss government because it's insane, but they didn't want to say they'd vote for anyone else either. So they're really Conservative voters who just couldn't bring themselves to say they're both Conservative. So what's happened to change the polls is a lot of those don't knows have now decided, actually now I can feel that I can vote for the Conservatives and Rishi Sunak. So what Rishi Sunak has mostly done there is converted don't knows rather than take them from Labour. Because once you lose votes, if you lose votes to a don't know, that's fine. Don't knows can come back. But if you lose them to another party, it's very difficult to get them back. It takes quite a long time. So a lot of these Tory MPs are worried about losing support to Reform UK and it being permanently lost. So they're panicking now, because now Rishi Sunak has not only said that he won't stop the boats this year, he's now suggesting he won't stop them in time for the election. So they're a bit worried. But anyway, let's catch up with some more comments. Where's the general strike? Where are the riots? Well, we don't really do that in this country, do we? We grumble, we complain while we're munching our cornflakes. But there we go. Right, let's go up. Let's try and find some more comments. They spent £3 billion on agency doctors because of shortages and well, there's agency nurses as well. They spend a fortune for. So paying to stop doctors leaving is an investment well worth paying, of course. In fact, £3 billion is 3 times as much as it would cost to pay the doctors what they're asking for. And being honest, they don't even have to pay the doctors what they're asking for to stop the strike. So you never do. Whenever someone goes on strike and they have their demands, it's like any negotiation, isn't it? You'll always settle for less. So, it would cost one. I mean, I know in reality, because £1 billion to settle for the doctors, obviously, I know it's not as simple as that, because if you settle with the doctors, you then have to settle with the nurses and all the other public sector workers as well, teachers. Teachers are going on strike as well. So in reality, it would cost quite a few billion. But like I said, they don't have to. They can end the strikes with a lower agreement than is being demanded at the moment. At the moment, they're not attempting any. They're not trying to find common ground at all. They want doctors to leave the profession. They want the NHS to collapse. Rishi Sunak was again yesterday saying, well, we just need to replace, if the NHS can't cope, we just need to replace it with the private sector, which is what they've been pushing all along. The French burn the country down over pension age changes. Yes, their pension, what was it, going from, is it 62 to 64 years? Whereas ours is already 67 for my age and is likely to go up to 68, 69, even 70. And there won't be anything other than a bit of complaining. But yeah, I actually saw the footage of in the early days of that strike. It was in a cafe, I think, indoors, like a restaurant. And there were people just as normal, just doing their thing in the restaurant. And through the window, you could just see the whole street was on fire. Quite incredible. I mean, the thing is that 62, 64, thank you. I thought it was. It's quite, I wish there was a happy medium. I think the French go too far. Like the rubbish strikes in Paris, I thought, yeah, that's good. Okay, that's fine, because that's very visible. So you don't collect the waste for a few weeks. Great. Setting fire to your own town, though, it's like you're shitting on your own doorstep there. Protest, make life uncomfortable for politicians, but don't actually set fire to your own city. There should be a happy medium between the British, who we don't do anything other than complain and do nothing, and the French who set fire to things. Like somewhere in between. David, they're saying, I think it's really humiliating the test immigrants have to pass. Honestly, knowing the height of London ire when Theresa May resign is odd. I had a go at a practice one. So you can do practice ones to get ready for it. And 2 of the questions were wrong for a start. One of them asked, how often is the national lottery draw? Now, for a start, straight away, you look at that and you think, you don't need to know that. What's the purpose of a citizenship test? To make sure you can integrate into society. You don't need to know how often the national lottery is drawn. But I'll tell you something, it's drawn twice a week, Wednesday and Saturday. And yet, 2 was not one of the answers. It wanted 1. That is well out of date. That's over 10 years out of date, I think, that, isn't it? And the other one was who's the Prince of Wales? Well, it's William. William wasn't an option, of course, because it's out of date. They still had it as Charles. And some of the questions, although I actually passed it, some of the questions were really obscure, had nothing to do with life in the UK. I mean, it was like history and things like that. And it's just absolutely appalling. The whole point of, it's a test that you could give to the average person who'd grown. Any citizenship test, if you give it to someone who's actually grown up in this country, they should be able to pass it. If you exclude people who might have severe learning difficulties, ultimately, a person who's grown up in this country is already integrated, right? If you cannot guarantee that 100% of people who don't have severe learning difficulties, if you cannot guarantee that they could pass it, the citizenship test is not fit for purpose. It's an absolute nonsense. I bet I could only pass it because I actually have some passing history of knowledge of British history. But anyway, the American test about their history as well. Yeah, no, but apparently the American test is actually easier for someone outside of America to pass than ours is for someone inside the UK to pass. But anyway, I'm British. I don't have a clue about football. Well, that's neither do a lot of people. It is an absolute nonsense. But anyway, we'll run out of time again, I'm afraid. Thanks very much for coming on. Do subscribe for more of these. I think it'll probably be Graham again on Monday. And I'll think of other things to say at the end of the videos for next week. I'm also going to try, I don't know what it'll have sounded like, not only because I broke the thing that softens the sound on my microphone, I need to replace it, but it has gone through Graham's as well. But I haven't seen lots of comments saying that it's not coming across properly. So I'm just gonna put one thing that I forgot to put up before, which is really important. Get my head out the way again. This is waiting list. I should have mentioned this when we did waiting lists. The blue is the waiting list under Conservative government. The red is under a Labour government. And the other blue is under this Conservative government, but it stops short of the pandemic, so they don't get to blame COVID. We could still see what was happening to waiting times then. But thanks very much for coming on. Have a very good morning to the rest of you. Continue to have a happy Friday. Until next time, I'll see you later.